Welcome back to Morning Joy, where truth matters. I'm your host, Keith Downey. And should we want mystical gifts? And why would God make some people have some of these gifts and some people not? Well, we'll talk all about that and mysticism and more with Debbie Giorgianni and Adam Blai. Take it away, Debbie and Adam.
Good morning, Keith. Thank you so very much. We love being here for The Next Right Thing. And I am Debbie Giorgianni with Adam Blai. And Adam, we're going to be talking about mysticism today, these supernatural gifts. And, they sound great on the surface, but let's talk about what happens behind the scenes, because I think that's really important when we can understand how the human, the human condition, the human mind enters in there with the person that receives the gift and also the people around them. So I think it's important in this day and age that we understand this, because as God continues to show himself, we must really be humble and observant and be respectful and prayerful, because these are important times we live in.
Yeah, Deb. So, I wrote a good bit about mysticism in one of my books because, boy, when I got into it, it's a fascinating topic, and I think it's important to understand a little more deeply than reading memes on the internet or listening to an interview on the internet, because the church has thought really deeply about mysticism down through the centuries, and so many of our saints, we hear these stories about them that are very exciting, like Padre Pio seeing his guardian angel, or a saint levitating like St. Joseph of Cupertino, which I think it was over 70 times people saw him levitating. And we're not talking a couple inches, we're talking in the church, floating up above the crowds, up into the rafters of the church kind of thing. So we hear about these exciting stories, or Padre Pio with the stigmata, and we think like, oh, that's amazing, isn't that neat? That's what they're all about. And actually, the church clearly figured out a long time ago that all of these gifts that are considered, mystical gifts, and mysticism is really just a direct connection with God, or a direct manifestation of God in the person's life. All these mystical gifts, they're considered secondary and not important. What do I mean by that? They're considered secondary effects of what's called divine ecstasy or religious ecstasy, which is a unitive connection with God. They're not considered an end unto themselves, and they're not considered as the important thing at all. They're considered like a side effect of a person's deep connection with God. And that deep connection with God goes both ways. So the person, by grace, is pursuing God in a very deep way, and God is also reaching out and touching that person's life in a special way. The primary thing is that connection. It's not the gift. So we shouldn't think of mysticism as a goal or an end unto itself, that I'm doing all these prayers and I'm doing all this stuff because I'm hoping I'm going to get this gift of, maybe reading hearts, or knowing things, that are hidden, or being able to see the poor souls. You don't pursue God to get these gifts. That's like a disordered way to pursue God. And not everyone who advances very far in the spiritual life gets mystical gifts, right? And not only that, Deb, but sometimes the mystical gifts are just given by God. That connection is made by God, even when the person hasn't pursued the spiritual life deeply. Think of the children at Fatima. Mm-hmm. The children at Fatima, they weren't religious who had been praying,
looking for that,
that had been praying in a monastery for 40 years, and pursuing God and studying. They didn't even know how to properly pray the rosary. They had to be taught. Like, these were little kids. They were praying, and they believed. They had some instruction, but God can do whatever he wants, and we shouldn't pursue these gifts as if they're kind of the goal.
Right,
Go ahead.
Right. Well, but there's a common theme that runs through so many of these recipients of these spiritual gifts, through the ages. If you look at Saint Joseph of Cupertino, and there's an article that we're going to post. Tim, our senior producer, is going to post it. It's an EWTN article, and folks, I'm telling you, when you read this article and the history of Saint Joseph of Cupertino, you cannot make this stuff up. This was a boy that was born into poverty. He wasn't wanted. It was a horrible life. He was sickly. His own parents, pushed him aside. And his friends, he didn't have any friends. Everybody made fun of him. Keith touched upon his learning disabilities. It goes way beyond that. This poor kid anytime something would happen, he would startle easily. It was just terrible way to grow up. And yet when he went into the monastery, they kicked him out the first time. It was terrible the way they treated him. Yet through his obedience and humility and his willingness, Adam, to receive it, that's what I think is the beauty of these great saints that get these spiritual gifts. I think of Saint Francis of Assisi. I think of Saint Joseph of Cupertino, Padre Pio, and others. Their willingness to receive God's supernatural gifts. He was so innocent, and he didn't have all these things that he was trying to prove, or he was trying to, he wasn't trying to be better than anyone else. And then God showered him with these incredible gifts. Although it was a cross for him, because again, when he went on to be a priest, they made fun of him. They put him in seclusion for many years. But more miracles, I think, are attributed to Saint Joseph of Cupertino than pretty much any other saint. I mean, he's way up there with the miracles. And so that's what I'm trying to say. It's the coolest thing to see when God chooses to impart these gifts.
Yeah, and in his example, most of the reading all the reading I can remember doing on him, when we talk about divine ecstasy or religious ecstasy, he would have these experiences during Mass. Not necessarily completely exclusively, but almost exclusively it was during Mass, or at least those were the ones that everybody saw because there was crowds of people.
And he would levitate up to the altar too, so that was another distraction, and that's where a lot of people got upset about. But go ahead. Right.
And so these gifts often manifest during sacraments or during times of, deep prayer, but very often it is during the Mass. Now, what are some of the gifts that somebody might have? St. Joseph of Cupertino, he levitated. One that most people aren't aware of is St. Teresa of Avila. She also would levitate. When would she levitate? During Mass, particularly around the consecration. What and here's a big one, Deb, and maybe we could talk about this.
Well, yeah, and don't forget about Padre Pio during Mass. His 4-hour masses, he would go frozen like a statue, and he would be bilocating all over the world.
Mm-hmm. And one of the aspects of all this is humility. Mm-hmm. So both with Joseph of Cupertino, who was very embarrassed by this and didn't want it to happen because he didn't want people to come and treat him like a spectacle and be distracted by what was happening. But he would be overcome with God. He would lose awareness of what was around him, and he'd be enraptured by God, and it would just happen. St. Teresa of Avila, she was in a cloister, so the priest was on the other side of the grill or the kind of grate saying Mass for them. She would have sisters kneel on either side of her and grab her shoulders and hold her down on the kneeler during the consecration because she didn't want the priest to see her levitating and be distracted. Mm-hmm. One of the signs of genuine mysticism, Deb, and this runs through all the saints, is humility and not wanting to say, look at me.
Exactly.
And another big warning sign is when money becomes involved. So when somebody wants attention for mystical gifts as if it's something they own or they're doing, that's a big warning sign that it's not real, that it's not of God. And of course, when somebody wants to exploit mystical gifts for money, that's a huge red flag, because if it's God's, and it's not something that we sell, right? It's a gift for the world, it's a gift for that person, but it's also a gift for those that God allows to be aware of it. We gain kind of faith and inspiration by these gifts. So these are signs that God is giving to the world for God's purposes. Now, We have levitation. We have others that most people haven't heard of, like illumination. So some saints have glowed or emitted light from their bodies, not super
Or
bright,
scent,
blinding
or
light.
scent.
Yeah, or the room filling with pleasant scents like flowers during different moments that the person is usually not aware of themselves at all, but everybody else is aware of. And by the way, this continues after death for a lot of these saints. The body will emit this scent of flowers for days or weeks after they pass, which is not normal.
Right.
There's the stigmata that so many people have heard about with Padre Pio. There are the ability to understand all languages and be understood by other people, that we see that with the apostles. Remember, after they received the Holy Spirit, they started preaching and everybody heard them in their own languages. There's apparitions and there's others. And maybe on the other side of the break, Deb, we can talk about why it's not necessarily something we should want. We should accept it if God does it. But it's not easy. And it's often not fun.
Right. And it's not accepted. I mean, people don't think it's like, wow, this is so cool. Let me hang around with these people. They actually shun them. They disregard them. They banish them into faraway places because they don't want to be around them. And so that's the unfortunate part of how human nature reacts. But yes, on the next segment of the next right thing, let's talk more about this. I think it's an extraordinary feast day of Saint Joseph of Cupertino, because he has an incredible story. And I encourage all our listeners, please read the story. You cannot make this up. It's incredible how his obedience and humility came about in such a great way for this saint. I happen to know a lot about him because my sister is born on this day. So we used to hear a lot about of Saint Joseph of Cupertino. So if my sister Marianne's listening, happy birthday. But I wanted to say that it is so important if our listeners, our Morning Joy listeners, are in the car or getting ready to get in the car to go to school or getting ready for school, and you have kids that are in school and having difficult time taking exams. This is your go-to saint, Saint Joseph of Cupertino. He is the patron saint of examinations and students, and also pilots, of course, because he was the flying monk. Pilots and astronauts and all sorts of disabilities. He is your go-to saint. Please read his story, because many, many miracles are attributed to him. Because Adam, of his obedience and humility. You talk all the time, Adam, about, and we should hear it all the time, about our Blessed Mother being the model of obedience and humility. And then you look at these saints like Saint Joseph of Cupertino, Padre Pio, Saint Francis, Saint Teresa of Avila, all these other saints of great humility and obedience, even when their own order, the people that they're living with and they're ministering with and they're praying with and dining with, don't want them. They kind of totally disregard them for their spirituality. You know what? These folks are our role models. That's why the saints are so powerful right now for us, so we can learn about this. What do you say to that, Adam? I'm just so strong on this because I think the key to his, and it was a miserable upbringing this poor Saint Joseph had to deal with when he was growing up. It was just terrible. But because he was so beautifully open and obedient, God showered gifts on him. And it was difficult because he had to deal with his peers. But look how he rose to this level of a great saint.
Yeah, and Deb, you see that obedience play out in their lives. Also, like St. Joseph of Cupertino, he spent a number of years in isolation because he was ordered to. St. Padre Pio spent 10 years hidden from the public because he was ordered to, because a lot of people doubted the mystical gifts that he seemed to be displaying with the stigmata and reading hearts in the confessional. And we see tremendous humility and obedience throughout their lives that seem to go along with these gifts. If I could, Deb, I want to kind of explain a subtle point that might help some people. When we talk about mystical gifts, these outward signs that are visible, like levitation or illumination or the stigmata or seeing apparitions that leave some side effect that we're able to observe, like the sun dancing at Fatima. When we say that these things are secondary and not important, what I'm getting at is the outward sign is not important so much to that person. It can be used for us as an encouragement and as a sign that God is doing something here when we see somebody levitating. But it's not critical to what is critical for that person is the inward connection with God. So let me give you an example of this. With the stigmata, many people that were given the stigmata prayed that it not be visible, that they not receive actual wounds that other people could see, but that they experience the pain of it and go through the passion every Thursday and Friday of every week, which most people don't understand. The stigmatics don't just walk around with wounds in their hands. They go through the passion each week to a limited degree where they experience the whole story of Jesus' suffering. Now, you can find pictures of saints online and people that are up for sainthood, like Rhoda Wise in Canton, Ohio, who through prayer healed Mother Angelica when Mother Angelica was still a young layperson, healed her of an incurable stomach ailment that led partly to her conversion, that partly led to EWTN existing in the world. So Rhoda Wise, there's photos of her covered in blood, experiencing the stigmata. Now for her it was very visible, and Jesus wanted her to let people see it. So she, under obedience, allowed people to come and see what was going on. But the important part is what I'm saying is the inward part of the experience of the passion, which is offered up to God and brings grace into the world through voluntarily offering that up. The person has a choice. They don't have to go through it. They can always say no to God. That's what's important, is the divine ecstasy, the direct connection with God in the soul of that person through obedience and openness to that is what is important. If we see the outward sign, that is more for us in a secondary effect. It wouldn't change the fact that the person's experiencing the passion. Whether we see it or not doesn't change that. And the grace comes through their cooperation with God, not because they have a bleeding wound on their body.
Thank you for saying that. The grace comes through their cooperation with God. So how does that apply to us, Adam? How do we see it today in the next couple minutes? How should we start to apply this in our own spiritual journey?
Well, it's as simple as that. It's cooperating with God, meaning when you are moved to go pray or read up on St. Joseph of Cupertino, or maybe return to Mass after 20 years, or go to confession for the first time in a decade, that's a grace that you are receiving. If you're inspired by this broadcast and you say, I'm going to go to confession and go to Mass, I've been away from the church for a long time, that's a grace. It's not us. It's a grace that you're receiving. When we receive grace to repent, to fight temptation, to return to the sacraments, when we cooperate with it, that's our part. That's our free will where we say, yes, God, I'm going to cooperate with the grace that you're giving me, the inspiration that you're giving me in this moment. That's our little way of seeking divine ecstasy. We're just starting the journey towards God. And, for us living in the world, there's a certain amount of connection and awareness of God that we have, and we're going to have certain moments in our life that are going to be very special. We don't necessarily all levitate like St. Joseph of Cupertino. In fact, it's incredibly rare, and that's okay. Again, that's an outward sign. That's not the important thing. It's his closeness with God and his cooperation with grace that's important, and we all can do that.
Right, his connection. Blessed Carlo Acutis, perfect example. Go ahead.
And we shouldn't feel deficient because we're not flying around or having stigmatic wounds or, emitting holy scents and things like that. Don't feel deficient. It doesn't mean that you're less holy than St. Joseph of Cupertino. You could have a life of quiet holiness that has no outward signs, but is just as holy as him. Right. So God uses different people, different ways. Just cooperate with grace and have your own journey with God.
Amen to that. We have a lot more to say about this, as you can tell, and we don't have enough any more time. So we're going to send it back to Keith for the rest of Morning Joy. But please join us on the Spirit World this Saturday, 10 a.m. Central, 11 a.m. Eastern, when we'll be talking all about Padre Pio. Back to you, Keith.
All righty. Thank you so much, Debbie and Adam. A wonderful topic. Getting a lot of incredible feedback on YouTube and Facebook. So if you're not joining us on the radio, make sure to join on all of kind of like the social medias. It's a great way to kind of hang out with some other like-minded Catholics as you watch Morning Joy. And if you're just tuning in right now and you realize what a great topic you missed, it's okay. We're actually packaging the Next Right Thing for easy sharing on our podcast feed. So it's just specifically Debbie and Adam. So just know that that's a way for you to kind of share and also listen to some great quality, authentic Catholic content. That's a tongue twister right there. But to kind of briefly kind of mention what Debbie just talked about, St. Padre Pio is certainly a powerhouse of spirituality. His feast day is coming up soon, so you are going to join Debbie and Adam this coming Saturday as they examine his prayer life and so much more. So make sure to get your calendars out, 10 a.m. Central, 11 a.m. Eastern. And if by some chance you missed last Saturday's The Spirit World, it's a great topic, Cross of Christ, our banner leading us to spiritual victory. It's the means that Jesus used to defeat the powers of death and sin. And they both talked about the relics of the true cross and how effective they are against demons and solemn exorcisms. So if you did not catch that, by all means, make sure to search for The Spirit World on YouTube or Facebook. But coming up next, letting go and letting God work can certainly be challenging if we have a phone in our face all the time. But talk about that is Sissel Anderson on Fruitful Living, coming up right here on Morning Joy, where truth matters.
You're listening to Morning Joy, where truth matters.